That should do it. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Virtual Friday Dire Literary Series. And we've got a really, really great guest today. And he did something really fascinating. And we'll have him answer a lot of questions about that later on. But we want to just kind of get him comfortable in reading. So this is his website, which is briansoniawallace.com. And instead of reading people's bios these days, I just direct people at home to the website. If you're on Zoom, you can still hear us and go to the website, but it'll tell you where he's showing up, what his book is about, what he's done, and some great promotional videos. So, check that out. And well, let's get rolling here. And we will start with our reading with Brian Sonia-Wallace. So take it away.
Hello, thank you so much for having me, Timothy. Thank you, everybody. Here in Los Angeles, California, originally Tongaland. I am in Lincoln Heights, right by the train tracks and the LA River and Chinatown, and all of the dim sum therein. And I'm super excited to be with you all around the world and to get to read a little bit and share what the heck I've been doing for the last 6 years, because 6 years ago I had been laid off from a job and I was job hunting unsuccessfully, and thought that I would do a 1 month experiment and see if I could pay my rent writing poems for people in public. In like 5 minutes or less, because that's about the amount of time that you can get a stranger on the street to stand with you and engage with poetry. um, and I'd done it a couple of times before. I was like, I know that people will stop. I know that they tip some money. And so I just did it in a really intense way for a month back in 2014, and then I thought I would end up doing other things, and I haven't. I've kept doing that, and it sort of led to a bunch of weird and interesting things, including some of the residencies that I talk about in the book. So the book is called The Poetry of Strangers. Misleadingly, it's not a book of poems, it's a book of essays, but there are poems in the essays because it's a poem about, hey, Joshua's got it. Um, it's a poem. It's a book about the contexts that these poems were written in and how they took place. And I'm thinking right now a lot about the way that um, all of the ways that we write are sort of literary techniques. So what does it mean to be writing in public on a stranger's story? Um, so that's a little bit of preamble. Um, and I'll read a little bit from the book, and then I'll also read a little bit of what I'm working on in poetry right now, just from a personal angle, because I write a lot for other people, and I like some of that writing, and it is also terrifyingly and beautifully and inevitably uh, only ever first drafts, because I write on the typewriter in the moment and give it to them, and so then its form is fixed. So I've been of late just working on editing. Um, it's yeah, it's tough. So okay, here we go. This is a little bit of a piece. I think Joshua, you've heard this one before, but it'll be new to other folks. Um, in 2017, the Mall of America in Bloomington, Minnesota, uh, was a former baseball field that's been converted into a mall. So you can imagine the size of it. It has an amusement park inside. Um, had a writer in residence competition. Um, and I became the writer in residence and wrote in the mall in front of Wetzel's Pretzels for a week. And this is a little bit about that experience. The first thing the mall team tells me when I meet them is, you have to take a picture on the slime chair. I grin and nod like this is a normal thing for someone to say, and try to shut off the little voice in my brain that keeps asking dubiously, slime? It's midday by now, and the light spilling through the mall's skylighted ceiling reflects blindingly off the walls and polished floors. We head into the maelstrom of screeching children at the amusement park heart of the mall. The slime chair turns out to be a bulbous green plastic bench, built to look like Nickelodeon slime frozen mid-splat. I can almost see the grease of 1,000 children who've sat on it, locked in a daily struggle with the mall's team of North African cleaners in their hijabs. The mall PR team ceremoniously pull out their cameras and instruct me to sit, making me the focal point of this bizarre welcome ritual. I've only perched on the slime chair for a moment when it talks. I jump a foot in the air. Recovering, I look up at Chris and Dan and Sarah, who are laughing and congratulating each other. Now I understand firsthand what an experienced designer does. Chris comes over and helps me up with a big smile. Here, he explains, is his pride and joy. The voice that surprised me was one of 30 sound effects he'd programmed, emanating from deep within this plastic hulk. What I'd heard was a rumbling nonsense gargle that was gone as abruptly as it had begun, but he'd also randomized vibrations and gusts of wind triggered by anyone sitting on this seat to surprise unwary picture takers into genuine reactions. 5 of the effects are fart noises. Chris giggles like he's gotten away with something. He gleefully recalls watching a kid sit to the sound of a huge one letting it rip, prompting him to jump off and his mom to go off on him. "I didn't do it," the little boy insisted to his scolding mother. "It was the chair." It turns out that this hunk of plastic is more than a farting chair. It's a centerpiece in the vision this group has for the mall. Over lunch, Chris tells me of his desire to rebrand Mall of America from mall to themed entertainment destination. The phrase physically hurts me a little, but I understand what he means. In 2017, God, even more so in 2020, right? You don't need to go anywhere to get stuff. The great challenge of retail spaces now, Chris tells me, is to create experiences you want to have with other people. We talk about how space itself can perform and get people to perform in different ways. In contrast to the placelessness of the hotel and the IHOP, the Mall of America is bucking the trend of malls closing by investing in giving people unique experiences that fill in the space between identical franchise shops. The slime chair photo op is something Chris fought hard for and is able to hold up as a mark of success for his new model. It's not a ride, it's not generating revenue, but it makes a day at the mall into more of a story. How can you put a number value on that? Chris's job is to remind the higher-ups that every visitor needs to come away with the story of a flesh and blood experience if the mall wants to remain relevant in this instant gratification online world. He says he's constantly fighting to carry over these types of experience elements from the amusement park into the rest of the bleached white retail space, but it's a frustrating process to get there. I had wondered why I was here, but now I knew. My role for the next 5 days was to be the latest chess piece in this battle for the driving vision of the Mall of America. I would be the farting chair, Phase 2. And I'll go a little bit further because there's a poem coming up, so I'll read through that and then do a poem and then take some questions. So that's the context. Here's a little sliver of the result. For 5 days, this was my setup. Each day for 4 hours, I'd be stationed at a different place in the mall. I'd arrive at the standard issue mall white table and chairs and set up on my typewriters. A teal Olvetti for myself and a Smith Corona I'd painted orange-yellow and decorated with roses, which I kept facing outward as an invitation for kids to try the typewriter for the first time. I would write poems for 100 people who came up to me and answered the question, "What do you need a poem about?" Every time I write for strangers in public, I'm nervous. I always wonder, will this be the time, the place where no one wants a poem? But even at the mall, when we set up to take photos, people stopped and I breathed a sigh of relief. Poetry would work here next to Wetzel's Pretzels. When a middle-aged woman just passing by learned that I was writing poems based on any topic people gave, she barked, "My word is Disney," so quickly and aggressively that I jumped. We were just doing photos, I hastily explained. I wasn't writing yet. The first person I wrote for was Dan, the head of PR and my de facto boss during this time. He was the one I found out who'd read each of the 4,300 applications for the writer in residence, though the employee who had the idea in the first place had somewhat ominously been sacked for being a bad fit. While I couldn't escape the knowledge that Dan was feeling me out while I wrote for him, judging if he'd made a good gamble on me as the spiritual successor to the farting chair, he started things off with a surprising burst of vulnerability. Dan wanted a poem about his son, Bryce. Bryce was a father himself now, to a little boy named Franklin, and the poem would be part of Dan's gift to Bryce for Father's Day that Sunday. Dan told me about a trip to Disney World for his 50th birthday that his son surprised him with, about raising a kid as a single dad and his hopes that the next generation would do better than he could. He and his son share a love of Disney, he told me, those Florida vacations a point of easy intimacy in a world where grown men are rarely allowed to show their feelings to one another. When I asked their favorite Disney story, Dan said Peter Pan, the boy who never grows up. And this is the poem that came from that interaction. For Bryce, who never stopped believing in fairies, even when all evidence pointed in the opposite direction. We were lost boys, both of us, growing up together despite our best intentions. Nothing gives me more pride than seeing you with Franklin, taking the time to teach him to fly. Every parent's wish is for their kid to grow up to be better than they were. As you begin your journey into fatherhood, I am beaming. We have faced our crocodiles. They will not stop us from coming back for more. There is no one I would rather not grow up with than you. I was about halfway through reading the poem out loud when Dan started to tear up. All of his staff was gathered around, with a camera crew from a local news station to boot, and the silver-haired man who was the reason I was here in the first place just bawled and hugged me and disappeared. Day one, and I'd made my boss cry, and he liked it. But Dan wasn't the last person to cry in front of me outside Nordstrom. The mall team was keen that I track certain metrics so that they had fun facts to share on social media. Number of poems written, number of steps walked around the building's cavernous interior. After my first day of writing, I started keeping another tally. The number of people who cried. It happened every day like clockwork. 4 or 5 people would come away from our interaction with water streaming down their faces, weeping openly in front of the Lego store. In the end, 20% of the people I wrote for in the mall wound up in tears. When people come to a mall, especially this mall, they come to scratch an itch. People come with an intention. They're looking for something. Sometimes it's ice cream, sometimes clothing, and sometimes it's just reconnecting with family. Old folks who come for exercise in the morning give way to afternoon shoppers and diverse family in the evening, tourists and immigrants alike indoctrinating their kids in Americana. Everyone's in a special state, somewhere between empty and full, invisible and seen. The mall boasts that it's the #1 tourist destination in the Midwest, with 40 million annual visitors. It might not be the happiest place on Earth, but it's big enough to be of America. And I'll stop there. Thank you so much. I'm not hearing you, Tim. Uh-oh.
There I am. Sorry.
Hello.
I have 2 mute buttons because I'm special. So anyway, I was so I have a lot of questions. You don't have to read the questions in the chat, but just relax, be chill. There's some great stuff that came up that I thought of. On your bio, you said in 2012 you set up your typewriter for the first time to do this. Was that before you worked for the Mall of America, or was that after?
That was before, so that was the first foray into doing it. So I'd done it maybe 3 or 4 times before I was like, let me try to make a living at this for a month. That was in 2014.
As writers, we have this inner editor, always the self-dialogue. Now, when you were writing poems for people, were you self-critiquing them as you went, or?
There's always an element of that. I mean, I come from a to some degree a performance improv background, and I think that that's been really helpful in doing what I do. And one of the first rules of uh, improvisation is yes and. So the idea that whatever the other person in a scene has given you, your job is to build on that, and you're not allowed to reject any part of it. They have established the reality. So in some ways, I feel like my writing a poem is me, number one, yes, anding the reality of that the person has brought to me. So there's a little bit of a sense that I'm not going, well, what should I write about today? I am told. I'm given an assignment, and then the second piece is yes anding yourself, where you write a line and you go, that was trash. That was completely cliche and unoriginal and had no interesting words. And what was I talking about? And there isn't the option to go back and take it out. You just have to write a better line next. And so there's an interesting process, I think, that happens in that where you're going, or, I mean, as you heard in that poem, it sort of loses the central metaphor and then comes back to it. And you're like, oh, but this was the metaphor I was on, You're sort of uh, finding your way down like some rapids, which is also a really gratifying process in that I think it kind of puts you into a little bit of a trance state where you're not able to have that take that time to edit because the person is standing there watching you as you write, and so you just have to continue.
Did
So
anyone
that's
ever give you something that was so emotional, awkward, and maybe that you just didn't want to write about it? Or
I
like,
only Yeah, I really like, and it's interesting because I've been bringing together kind of gatherings. You'll see on the website gatherings of typewriter poets because there are folks all over the country who are doing this, and everyone takes a little bit of a different approach, and all over the world, really. Um, my question has remained, what do you need a poem about? Because I find that that opens the door for a lot of different experiences. Some people will ask like, what do you love, or what are you trying to manifest in your life, and they'll direct it a little bit more. I quite enjoy playing, unlicensed like grief counselor and space holder. I don't mind those roles. The only poem that I've turned down in the last few years that I remember a guy coming up and saying, "Will you write a poem that will get my girlfriend back with me?" And I said, "No." Um, Number one, like I don't want to promise something I can't guarantee to deliver, and number two, I don't know you. Are you a good fit? Tell me about it. Like let's talk about this and see how things are. Um, and I did write him a poem of apology, but I did not. I think it's about intention, right? It's what we say the poem is for, what we say the poem is going to do, and I love that idea that like these are poems to do something. Like what do you need your poem to do for you today? That there's a sense of agency in that I like.
did you ever have an interaction in this process go bad, or like, what was the worst interaction you ever had with someone?
Still, I think this was like 2013. Oh man, yeah, it was so bad. There was a woman who was really proud of like her Salvadoran heritage and wanted a poem about that, and I was writing it, and I was looking for like the perfect food metaphor to finish it, and I should have asked her because that's the smart thing to do. But I went on Google on my phone instead, kind of sneakily, and I ended up winding the poem down on a chicharron metaphor, which is like crackling pork. And she totally thought I was calling her fat, and that was not my intention.
No.
That's that's the only time that's happened, but it sticks in my head like it was fresh and happening right now. Oh my god, the horror of accidentally insulting someone in like a juvenile way, like not in any deep or profound way, but just like, oh, you think that my life is like pork? You know?
Like, hey, it's a metaphor. I'm not calling you crackling, but once you reach that point, you're not going to get into a teaching mode about metaphor. Now, on the flip side, was there ever like a poem that you thought was absolutely great that you felt that when you ended up giving it away? I mean, do you keep a copy? Do you have carbon paper? Do you take a picture of the poems that you like? Or...
I started taking pictures, but only after a couple of years of doing it. I only started documenting it when I did my month challenge. So the first poems that I wrote in this way, I remember some of them a little bit, but I have no idea what most of them said. Um, and there is something that I found really liberating when I started about doing that. The idea that like this really wasn't for me or about me. Like I wasn't even going to keep a copy of this poem. it was for that person. I'm just seeing Becca's question in chat. I totally have experiences or had experiences then where I was like, oh, but I really like that line. And I know that I'm going to write another poem and it's going to go out of my head instantly. And I'm just going to have to keep going. So I have missed some poems, but now I take pictures of them, and embrace the anachronism of like having like a Remington Rand and then an iPhone and just being there with those things and going, well, 2020.
Well, to continue on that theme, is every poem unique, or did you find yourself falling back into a formula or a theme that you've used before?
Yeah, I'm working on that right now, to be honest. Like I find I definitely, as metaphors go, oh, I am a mountains, forests, and oceans guy. Um, Animals are great, but that's often a prompt, so that is a little bit more interesting. Where if someone's talking to me about, say, their loved one, and they only have really boring things to say about their loved one, which happens often. We're pretty bad at talking about each other. Um, you say what kind of animal would they be if they were an animal, and then you get it. It's like a third grade exercise, but you get interesting answers.
No one said
Um,
a crackling pig, right?
I have yet to hear someone describe their loved one as a crackling pig, which maybe is a clue. Um, but yeah, no, I mean, I find myself going into metaphor. I find myself there's certain like rhythms or cadences, and I think this is very much like coming from a spoken word background. The poem has to you have a 3x5 card or a 4x6 card, and you have to do this, right? You have to build, you have to have some sort of arc or climax, and you have to have some sort of resolution, um, kind of in performative terms. But other than that, like it's great because you just get to do, I'll write, 30 or 40 poems in a night. And so just to keep yourself entertained,
Did it
you
improve
are,
your poetry writing by doing that?
oh yeah. I mean, I look back at my early stuff and I'm like, you know, you've come some ways.
All right,
And
now
even now,
go
I'm
ahead.
working more on editing now, and I look at the poems that I've been spending time with in editing, and I look at the poems that are coming out, whole cloth, and I go, oh, those are really not great in comparison.
Now, did you see the David Foster Wallace movie that featured the Mall of America, or not?
Oh man, I saw it's so funny. I saw the movie, but before I did the residency, I don't remember it. I mean, I remember it being very David Foster Wallace. It's the Midwest. The asphalt is gray. The sky is gray. My life is gray. I'm a talented writer. Um, but I don't remember them all being in it. What did it play? What role did it play?
This is a question from someone else, so I don't know.
John,
It's the one that he drives across the country with him. John, is that correct?
end of tour, right? No.
John, do you want to give us?
Yeah, there's a guy who's like a struggling writer who goes to write an article on David Foster Wallace, and he goes to David Foster Wallace's home, and just sort of hangs out with him a little bit. And one of the things they do is go to the Mall of America, and DFW is just, so, naive and childlike, and his enthusiasm for things there at the mall is basically what it was about.
Thank you, John. Do you have any? Did you write any Shady Mall stories after being there, or did you see any Shady Mall stories while while you were there?
You say Shady Mall?
Yeah, shady, like something weird and shady happened. Maybe a great pretzel heist or crack deal going on in front of you.
Uh, no, no, nothing that explicit. I mean, it was an interesting and fraught time as it always is at these years. Um, I was there shortly after Philando Castile was killed, and so there were protests rocking downtown Minneapolis, and I spoke with a number of people who were at the mall who were in a really interesting way were activists who had kind of come to get out of the protest. They were that was their R&R was, I'm going to go fight for justice and then I'm going to go eat Chipotle. I think that's the human condition right now.
Now, Rebecca said, "Did you ever have someone approach that you felt was unpoemable?"
Ooh. Some people are difficult. There's the people who are like, what do you want a poem about? And they're like, love. And you're like, what kind of love? And they're like, just love. You're like, I'm gonna need you to meet me halfway here. Um, there's a lot of people who want poems about their pets, and different typewriter poets have different feelings about that. I have done my best to lean into it and like read animal poetry by the greats, because all the greats write about their dogs. You know, it's not like a dog is a bad subject for a poem. It's just other people's animals are really uninteresting.
Yeah.
Um, Sort of, pets and babies. It's like, well, that is a object with a lot of your hopes and aspirations on it that does not have any affects of its own right now.
Well, that's what Billy
Um,
Collins said. If you're ever stuck in the middle of writing a poem, you just put a dog in it.
yeah, exactly. And then a Great Dane walks in. What happens next?
Now let's talk about your book. Now your book came out recently this summer, and it's on HarperCollins, which is great. Did you have an agent for this? Did they hear about you and approach you? How did that work?
Yeah, here's my advice for anyone who wants to get a book deal with HarperCollins is have a article about you in the New York Times, and then they read the New York Times, and then they say, "Hi, you're doing weird stuff. Do you want to write a book?" And you say yes, and they say, "Do you have an agent?" And you say no, and they say, "Okay, well, I know a guy. Here he is. He'll help you get your stuff in shape to show me because it's not ready to show me yet. But here, work with this person and get it in shape to show me." So it's like an extreme. I want to find a better word than like blessing, but it's I think in that category where it feels slightly miraculous to me. But I think the big thing is just figuring out what is happening in the zeitgeist and how to be a part of it, and then letting that carry it rather than I was writing poetry very happily, and then they were like, "Oh, you're going to write essays now," and I said, "Okay, I need to go read a full library's worth of essays and memoirs because I don't. That's not my genre."
Now, who really influenced you as an essay writer and sort of shaped you in this book?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, like my like classic influences are definitely I read like all of David Foster Wallace in college and just like you know massaged myself gently with oil. Um, I oh and then of course there's like Maggie Nelson, Bluets, and that sort of genre of essays. And I just read The Argonauts, which I'm super stoked about and want to talk to everyone about. Um, Joan Didion's another one of the classics where I don't think that you can be a writer in California without being in conversation with Didion. But contemporaries like John Jeremiah Sullivan is really great, does really interesting like pop culture analysis that is more long form and so has the space to say bigger things than like the immediate like think pieces. Um, Samantha Irby, I like that she's just disgusted with herself and lets all of us like revel in how that like bodily like, hey, I have a human body and it's weird and gross and sweaty. Do you want to like what is it like to be in someone else's skin? Um, those folks.
Now, how big was the process? Amy's asking this about what you had and getting it ready to show HarperCollins. And when it was, quote, ready to show, did you feel that it was ready to show? Were you nervous?
Oh, it's still not ready to show. I have so many edits. I mean, even as I'm reading it to you, I'm taking out sentences and changing words. And I've talked to a couple of writers who are like, "Yeah, that never stops."
That's right.
So the total process from initial discussions to publication took about 3 years, 3.5. Um, and that was already very much being like mid research when I started it. Um, and I did more travel and wrote about more places and people and stuff like that. And I mean, also questions of is this essays, is this memoir? There's a lot of genre questions that I think that I tackled, you know, successfully or not.
Did
Uh,
HarperCollins push you toward any genre in particular?
I mean, the whole form of it was sort of the editor who reached out was a nonfiction editor, and so she was interested in sort of travel stories. She was interested in thought pieces on kind of the state of America in all of its like messiness and contradictions and loveliness around how we're both like very intensely consumerist and very spiritual at the same time, and I find that kind of fascinating. And like spiritual about our consumerism, which is my favorite part. Um, so
Right.
yeah,
Another question. It's about our culture and America's culture. What do you think about it that people can have a human connection with a stranger with a typewriter?
say it again.
So, in our culture, how did it feel like, that people were making connections with a stranger with a typewriter?
Hmm. I think a lot about the idea that what I'm doing is sort of like I've recently made friends with a guy whose job is he juggles at an intersection. He juggles at like Washington and Vermont, usually in LA, and is a street performer and does clown work for cars and then collects tips. And I think I do something very similar. Um, and that there's a sense that you kind of put yourself like the typewriter is really important, I think, because you're setting yourself out in public space and you're marking yourself, and it's both a symbol that's associated with writing and it's also an anachronism, so you're sort of saying hello, I'm a time traveler, um, in a way that's doing work on a kind of subtextual level where you don't have to say anything else. And I think it fits in as well in a weird way with this narrative that like poetry is dead, and then here's this guy with a machine you never see, and you're like, oh, poetry can be dead, but here it is, still doing a thing.
When you wrote your book with the essays, were you writing it in real time? Because, you were having this experience going out and going across the country with your typewriter, or did you finish that journey and then sit down and write it?
It's a great question. It was a mix. Um, the first thing that the publisher said after I talked to her was I was about to go on this trip to the mall and taking Amtrak to get out there. Then I was at a music festival in Michigan after that, and you know, have it doing all of these sort of explorations. And she just said, make sure you take really good notes, and I did, and those became those chapters, and those are I think some of the best chapters of the book. And then I had sections that I tried to reconstruct from memory and from previous writing. And that was really intensely difficult. Um, and then stuff where I had ideas for narratives and directions that I wanted to go in, and so I sort of found people and contexts that would let me explore those themes, and went and visited them, and wrote with them and stayed with them, and I kind of started my life as like a late teen, really being invested in couch surfing and kind of that like sort of traveler lifestyle where you are traveling around with no money and sort of
Hobo.
trading on connections, um, personal connections. Trading on being friendly and telling stories and hearing stories and just being invested in that. So I think in some ways it's a continuation of that work.
Amtrak had a position for poet laureate. Did you apply for that?
So it was they had a writer in residence. So yeah, that was the other sort of big high profile residency that led to the article in the book. Is they have, well, had, I don't think they have it anymore, but for a number of years they had 5 or 6 writers a year that they would give um, basically a trip to. So you could plot it out and it could be around whatever, however long, however much of the country. So I traveled for about a month, on the train with a week here and 2 weeks there. Um, but it was a long time to be in a sardine can. Um,
Yeah.
my favorite essay maybe in the book is about the 95-year-old man who was in the room opposite me on the way out to Chicago. And so I just was best friends with a 95-year-old for 3 days on a train. Um, and
Did
that
you
was
write
it.
any did you write any of the essays in your book during lulls in times that you couldn't write poems for people? Like you're sitting out there with your typewriter and there's no traffic. Did you sit down and try to write essays in that lull period or not?
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of that period, once I'd started writing the book, I was trying to capture the actual space around me as I was writing. So I was taking notes on who the people were who were coming up and what they were saying and what, I work at a lot of weddings. So it's like, what is the minister saying? What is the rabbi saying? What are the ways that these spaces are already full of text and full of narrative? And then I'm just coming in kind of stirring the pot. Um, I think a lot of the essay writing for me, the process of it was very much remixing, where I had all of these notes and they were sort of observations, thoughts, connections, descriptions of places, and trying to figure out how to sequence them so that they flowed and so that they made sense, was the bulk of the writing.
So none of the essays were written on a typewriter?
Yeah, that's accurate. I think at least one of them was written in the notes section of my iPhone.
There you go. Last question, and we'll let you go. From Amy. So when you're on the Amtrak riding, was it in a sleeper car or did you write, in the cafe, like, writers write in cafes and coffee shops? So,
Yeah, no. Thank goodness for a 3-day journey. They did put me on a sleeper. But I wrote mostly. They call it the observation deck, which they've got kind of two stories of windows. And as you go across the country, it gets more and more Amish, which is kind of exciting to see. Um, but that was where I was set up on the train.
yeah, because in the East Coast, you're observing a lot of clotheslines and backyards. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. And
All
out here
right.
on the like deserts and industry, it's a lot of like shipping crates and factories.
All right. So I want to thank you very much for appearing at Virtual Dire. I'm going to show everyone a picture of your book again. There's the bio. But Brian, what is your favorite? We like to promote indie bookstores because they're struggling now and they're closing and they're having problems. So what is your favorite indie bookstore?
Yeah, I will put a link in the chat. So I've been selling for my launch and for a lot of other stuff through Book Soup in West Hollywood. And I actually just started this last year. If you click on Poetry of Strangers, I think that should take you to the book page. That's the link to get the book on books from Book Soup rather. They're a great local bookstore, and I'm working with West Hollywood for the next 2 years as their poet laureate, which is really exciting and interesting to have this sort of way of entering space with poetry, and then to think about what it means to do work with a city, and to think about trying to make sure that everybody who lives in this space and folks who are connected to this space have access to poetry, and that it's that folks who don't know that they're interested in poetry also are able to you know get in there.
All right. Well, that's really awesome. Thanks once again. So Book Soup, they do take online orders. So help them out. Get Brian's book. Maybe do some more Christmas shopping while you're there or holiday shopping. Whatever you do to celebrate is okay with me. So Brian, thanks a lot. I'm going to say goodbye to my Facebook friends in the group. And to remind them also, if they ever want to participate in the Q&A and or the open mic, use the Zoom link instead. But thank you for joining us. And I need to remind myself not to end the Zoom meeting and just end the Facebook stream. There we go.